Righto. My apologies to anybody if you feel I'm not giving enough coverage to lambs or enough to beef. I'm trying to cover it all, and there are a lot of common principles. There's a big range of subjects to cover here. So if you have any questions that we don't address during the presentations, feel free to talk to me afterwards. I will be around for the rest of the day, or most of the rest of the day. So come and pepper me. Right, principles of nutrition. This is like trying to describe the universe. This is a big topic. So diet formulation initially. Now this is not something that I necessarily expect you to be doing on farm, but if you have an understanding of the principles that underlie it, then you're able to look at your feed analyses and diets that are formulated for you, and for instance pellet specs, with a bit more of an understanding behind what you're reading. Energy is the first limiting nutrient. So a lot of people get uptight about protein. It's all about energy first and foremost, and then we formulate for protein. Energy first. So what we're trying to do is to maximise metabolizable energy. And metabolizable energy is probably best described as the energy available for use by the animal. So all energy systems are estimates, and we need to be aware of that. And with ME, we actually get an estimate of that figure from an equation that uses things that we can actually measure with wet chemistry from your feeds. So digestible organic matter and the dry matter, the amount of fat or ether extract, the amount of nitrogen, and we use those components to calculate what the energy might be. It's always an estimate, but it's a hell of a lot better than nothing, and it does work fairly well in practice. I would caution though that with mixed feeds you have to request a wet chemistry analysis. You can't do NIR or near infrared reflectance spectroscopy on mixed feeds and get a reliable result. So there's a lot of NIR machines around, and they're quite good with straight grain samples, and because they've got thousands of samples that they shoot the beam of light into and they get the characteristic spectrum, and they're able to calibrate that against known metabolizable energy figures determined using wet chemistry. When it comes to unusual feeds, I think they're okay for some hay samples. Silage I have a bit of a question mark over. When it comes to unusual or mixed feeds, they don't have the calibrations for your particular mixed sample. So you must request wet chemistry or you will get a misleading result. We're trying to hit 12.5 plus megajoules of ME per kilogram of dry matter for beef cattle in a feedlot and for lambs in a feedlot. Now that might sound pretty high. You'll see a lot of rations that might be down around 11. Not good enough in energy density. We really need to kick this up higher. That is the driver of low feed conversion ratio. So the faster animals grow, there's about an 83% inverse correlation with feed conversion ratio. The faster they grow, the better they convert, because you're paying maintenance every single day. And that's a cost, and that adds to your feed conversion ratio cost. Now, if you have growing animals, whether they're lambs or steers, don't ever feed to maintain them. You're just wasting that money. If you're going to do that, just sell them now. If you are going to feed them, chase high production to get the most out of the limited nutrients you have available. Go hard on it. Okay, protein. As a matter of interest, I don't know why I did that. As a matter of interest, does anyone have any idea the minimum crude protein that's required to get our optimum microbial protein yield? Does anyone have any idea what that crude protein figure should be? Yeah? 16. I'll go with you on the 16 for production, but it's not the minimum. But I'm certainly in favour of higher protein diets. Anyone else? 8? Bit low. We're shooting both sides of the target now. Yeah, got one down there. 12? Bloody close. You get the new car because you're closest. It's actually 13. Okay, so a minimum of 13% crude protein, which equates to about 11% rumen degradable protein. What is crude protein? Does anyone know how that's defined? It's very crude. Not vulgar, it's just very crude measure. Anyone? It's just nitrogen by 6.25 because that's about the proportion of nitrogen in proteins. So it's a very rough figure. What it's actually telling you is how much nitrogen is in that feed. So it's a pretty good indicator of protein in feeds that have a lot of true protein in them. But to give you an idea of how this works and to try to bend your minds a little, urea is something like 330% crude protein because it's got so much nitrogen in it. Question here or a point here?
So when you get your grain tested at the silo at Weybridge, is that protein test the same as crude protein?
Yes. Yes, it would equate to it. But in that case, it's going to all be true protein because it'd be bugger all non-protein nitrogen because it's in the grain. It's basically going to be true protein. So in some cases, crude protein can be entirely true protein. In some cases, it can be entirely non-protein nitrogen. Make sense? Sort of. I think we've just gone into a parallel universe. All right, we won't worry too much on it. Now, considering that all feeds have a certain amount of bypass protein, so what the hell's bypass protein? While we're on that, what's it bypassing? Well, the answer was protein that animal can't use. That's actually by-ass protein. That's the stuff that goes all the way through. but bypass protein is what's it bypassing? The animal can use it, but what's it actually bypassing? The rumen. And it's being digested and absorbed directly as protein subunits in the true stomach, or digested in the true stomach, and further digested and absorbed as protein subunits in the small intestine. So that's bypass. It's bypassing the rumen. There's an energetic efficiency to not allowing that protein to be broken down and turned into microbial protein and then washed out of the rumen into the abomasum and broken down to release the protein. You just deliver it directly. So that's more efficient. But it is the icing on the cake. The main driver, and remember this, the main driver of ruminant production is the rumen. So we feed the rumen first. Make sure that we're providing adequate fermentable carbohydrate, adequate energy and nitrogen to the rumen, and it will provide the vast majority of the animal's requirements. Bypass protein, which was really sexy about 10 years ago, is important, but it's the icing on the cake. Now, what I started to say was, considering that all feed has a certain amount of bypass protein, this 13% crude protein figure equates to about 11% rumen degradable protein. So that's what we need to get the best out of the rumen. So I don't subscribe to the factorial approach of saying, oh, if we only have 9.5, 10 megajoules ME, we only need 10% crude protein. I don't agree with that philosophy, that approach. We don't want to minimise, we don't want to limit the production of microbial crude protein by scaling our protein back. And that factorial approach also ignores the role of protein as a source of energy for the animal, so metabolizable protein. Because the animal can use those protein subunits, and in the liver, this is really neat, can actually back manufacture glucose from those protein subunits. So there's energy available to the animal from the protein, not just protein, if that makes sense. Right. So here's 16% was mentioned. I'm with you. 16 to 18% crude protein, depending on body weight, for starting lambs. So if they're going in, particularly if they're going in as little fellas, below 35 kilos, go for 18. If we're getting them in at 35 kilos plus, we'd start on 16%, and we wouldn't drop back much below that to get them finished, depending on the cost of protein. If protein is particularly expensive, then we might drop that back to 14 with heavier lambs late in the feeding period. But protein is generally quite inexpensively topped up with urea, depending on your feeding system. It's a cheap source of nitrogen to kick up that crude protein. You can certainly do that in total mixed rations. Much trickier and much more dangerous to do that through feeder bins, and it's something I'm not keen to do in feeder bins. Okay, weaners, weaner cattle, 16 to 18% crude protein, looking for 20% bypass protein or undegradable dietary protein. Looking for 20%, top them up. They have high protein requirements, these little cattle or lambs. Trade cattle, so cattle going to the supermarket, we generally start them on about 16% and we'd finish them on 14% crude protein once we got them up and flying. Now this is based on work from the US, I think it was Fluidy and Lersch, back in about 2005, and they found, and they have lighter cattle there, they generally place cattle a bit lighter, but they found that if they fed 16 to 18% crude protein in those starter diets, the advantage in growth rate for those cattle was actually maintained right through to the end of the feeding period. And that's a US feeding period of about 150 days. So it has a big effect. We've got to start them well to get them to finish well. Bullocks, we might feed them 13% crude protein throughout because we're getting some muscle accretion, but these animals have done a lot of their growing. So their protein requirements are not as high in terms of dietary density. Fat. Everything has fat or oil in it. Pastures, particularly newer cultivars of improved pastures like tetraploid rye and so on, there's quite a lot of oil in it. Now, there's a limit to how much oil we can stick into the rumen without causing problems for that rumen microbial ecology, because we kill off some species preferentially, and particularly the fibre digesting microbes we kill off first if we feed too much fat. So that interferes with the efficiency of rumen fermentation. There's a few ways that can occur. So the fat, particularly if you've got polyunsaturates, margarine will kill you, don't go near it. Particularly, I like butter. If you've got polyunsaturates, they can be incorporated in the membranes of the bacteria, which makes the membranes unstable, and you have less viable bacteria. They also can actually coat fibre particles and reduce access for the enzymes from the microbes to actually act on that fibre to break it down. So that reduces efficiency as well. And there can be direct toxic effects on the bacteria themselves. So we've got to be under 6%. We've ramped this up over the last few years. We used to be more conservative and try to keep it under about 4%. But we've found with high concentrate feeds, we can certainly get really good production up to 6%. And this is a cheap, sometimes cheap, it's a source of energy that's very energy dense. So if you have oil seeds, for instance, the oil itself is about 37 megajoules of ME. And pure starch is about 14. So you just can't beat it for energy density. But we can't feed too much or we knock around the rumen. Fibre. We know what dairy fibre should be. And this is defined as neutral detergent fibre. Who's heard of NDF? We got a few? Got a few. Okay, just a few. So that is a definition of what's left after you take a feed sample and grind it up and soak it in this neutral detergent for 24 or 48 hours, I can't remember what it is. You see what's left. It has bugger all to do with how that fibre actually acts in the animal. But it's a bit of an indication of the fibrous content. So we know in dairy cattle that if we drop below about 32% NDF, their milk fat drops because we reduce the acetate yield in the rumen. We're not getting as good production of the volatile fatty acid that arises largely from the fermentation of fibre. I think I just lost you. I'll keep going. With beef and lambs, we don't know what that figure should be. So we know what the fibre figure should be for dairy. We don't know what it should be for beef or lambs. Now, we sometimes get a little bit fooled with the comparisons between lambs and beef, and we have to bear in mind that lambs select a much lower fibre intake than cattle will. Those dexterous little buggers will go into a lucerne paddock and just eat all the leaves off. So their intake ordinarily of fibre is lower than that for cattle. So we know it's going to be lower, but we just don't know exactly what it should be. So what we do in practice is we feed to maintain rumen health. So in cattle, we feed so that we avoid the clinical signs of ruminal acidosis in terms of bubbly scours. In lambs, we don't want anything below the consistency of toothpaste. And I get scared when the faeces looks like toothpaste. We're bordering on causing ruminal upset at that stage. Now this fibre figure does not describe, as I said, how the fibre actually behaves in the animal as effective roughage. And effective roughage is incredibly important to rumen health What does it actually do? What does effective roughage do in the animal? Cleans it out. So it keeps the papillae clean. It actually slows down rumen outflow rate, the more fibre you have there, but it keeps the papillae clean. The papillae are those little projections on the lining of the rumen that absorb all those fermentation end products, incredibly important to production. What else does fibre do? Increase? Body heat. It has a higher heat increment of fermentation, yeah. Okay. Yeah, we've got a higher heat increment of fermentation, I guess, so it generates more heat to ferment a certain quantity of fibre as opposed to concentrate. Not really what I'm looking for. In terms of rumen health, maintains a you've cut straight to the end point here, haven't you? Answer is maintains a more stable rumen pH. How does it do that? You've lost marks for going straight to the end. You didn't give me the building blocks. How does it do that? How is roughage important in maintaining rumen pH? Well, we've got to take a step back. Normal fermentation in the rumen produces volatile fatty acids. These are weak acids, and if there's more of them produced than can be absorbed per unit time, they push pH down. Now, fibre tends to counteract that. So how does it do that? Any idea? What happens to your salivary glands when you're in a sao sculling competition? They go burko. Absolutely, it makes them chew and salivate. And saliva has bicarbonate and phosphate buffers in it. So to give you an idea of the importance of that, you can produce about 10 times the amount of bicarb in saliva and deliver that to the rumen compared with putting bicarb in the diet at about 0.751%. So effective roughage delivers buffers to the rumen because it makes them chew and salivate, and that's incredibly important to rumen stability. Right, average daily intake. If you want a guide as to what these buggers are going to eat, beef, we've dropped that to about 2.5% of body weight. It used to be 2.7. I think that's probably too high now, and we frequently, with really energy-dense, nutrient-dense diets, we can run at 2.2, 2.3% of body weight. So I used to get worried and go, bloody hell, they're not eating enough. But because our dietary density has improved so much, we're actually achieving lower intakes, which gives you, for the same growth rate, needless to say, a rip-roaring feed conversion ratio advantage. Lambs will eat up to 3.9% of their body weight as dry matter. Now, intake is very important, so we want them to maximise their intake, but without causing digestive upset, and I'll tell you later how we do that. Calcium to phosphorus. Now, I had a specific question on this during the break, and I will take a few minutes to address this because it's really important with the feeding of lambs, and it is causing us a bit of trouble. Calcium to phosphorus ratio needs to be at least 1.5 to 2:1. Now, the NRC recommendation is at least 1.1:1, I think it is. It's too low. Make sure you've got more calcium in, make it broader. And the reason is we want to stop urolithiasis, or urinary stones, calculi that lead to blockage of the urethra in lambs particularly. That's what you'll see early on, just a swollen sheath. Then on postmortem, there's our stones. And these are actually, we've got stones in the renal pelvis here, in the kidney itself. Mostly we only find them in the bladder. I'm not sure how they've managed to form so high up in the urinary tract. Where we look first and foremost is bladder, and then we trace the urethra. That's the stones in cattle, like grains of sand mostly, and they lodge, often in cattle, they'll lodge in the sigmoid flexure, which is that curvy bit in the pelvis. So you've got to trace it all the way through. Can be quite spectacular in cattle. I was actually doing this postmortem, this was up in central Queensland many years ago, and I didn't actually formulate the diets, and I rang the bloke who formulated the diets and I said, we have to do something about calcium to phosphorus here, and he said, oh, it's about what it should be. Yeah, it's 1.1 to 1. I said, well, it's not. He said, no, it's pretty right. I said, well, if you listen really closely, you can hear them falling over, dying from urinary stones. So I think we might have to broaden that. And you end up with this belly full of urine when the bladder ruptures. They absorb all those nitrogen compounds and basically they become toxemic and you cause a chemical peritonitis. It's a horrendous thing. And sheep are quite stoic when it comes to urinary stones and they don't give you much sign. Cattle get up to all sorts of antics, and they'll walk backwards and tread on the spot and throw themselves down. Sheep just seem to stand there and feel bad. And once the bladder ruptures, you can almost see a smile on their face and they go, oh, that's better. And then they die about 24 hours later. Okay, and there's a bladder that hasn't even actually ruptured, but the pressure has been such, that's that red thing there, that the fibres had pulled apart and the urine was leaking out. So, lambs and steers are prone to the formation of those urinary stones because they've got a narrow urethra. Concentrates are high in phosphorus, universally. So that's our issue with the calcium to phosphorus ratio. Low roughage leads to reduced salivation, therefore less phosphorus is lost via the saliva in the faeces, and you end up with more phosphorus in the urine. High concentrates also have high concentrations of low molecular weight peptides, which are protein subunits, which can act as a scaffold for holding salts in the urine. So struvite, magnesium ammonium phosphate, and I'm sure you were all just about to repeat that, that's the most common form. So magnesium and phosphate are the big players here. Sometimes we get calcium oxalate, and sometimes where we're feeding outrageous amounts of sodium bicarb, for instance, and you really alkalinise the urine, you can end up with calcium carbonate stones. But it's not just about those macro mineral concentrations. But excess phosphorus reduces calcium absorption, and high phosphorus relative to the calcium actually promotes calculi formation. So ideally we want phosphorus to be less than about 6 grams per kilogram. That's the real killer. We won't worry about that. Okay, excess magnesium interferes with calcium and phosphorus metabolism as well. So we try to keep that under about 5 to 6 grams per kg, because otherwise we're interfering with the interaction between those other minerals. There are very few interactions between minerals that don't have negative effects. Pretty much always you're going to counter one with another. But it's not just that mineral balance, because if you look at grazing lucerne, it's quite similar to a lot of prepared feeds that we feed the lambs. We seldom ever see urinary calculi on grazing lucerne, and we can feed it for months at a time. So there's more to it than that. The other thing is that salivation, restricted water intake, and this can be an issue through winter when they're naturally drinking less anyway, so that causes more concentrated urine. Alkaline water with high mineral concentration. So if you're having issues with it, look at your water, especially if it's bore water. If you've got big licks of magnesium in there, you will be prone to having issues with urinary stones. If you put too much of these alkalinising agents or buffers like bicarb into your feed, you can make the urine more alkaline, and when it's more alkaline, those stones are more likely to form. And has anybody had the mispleasure of having to deal with sorghum down here? Oh man, it's a bugger of a feed. So sorghum has a higher concentration of those low molecular weight protein subunits that acts as a scaffold for the formation of those stones as well. So that's another thing to be careful of with sorghum. The other issue with sorghum is that, we'll talk about this when we get to processing. Vitamin A deficiency can also be an issue with urinary stone formation, because the cells on the lining of the bladder tend to slough off, to flake off, and they can form a basis for those minerals to adhere to as well. Okay, so we have these protein subunits. They bind magnesium and some of these complex cations, ammonium phosphate. Crystals grow into calculi, which are then really insoluble in alkaline urine. If we run into a problem, one of the first things we do is acidify the urine. So we chuck ammonium chloride in at up to 1%. It takes about a week to acidify the urine. We will get some resolution with struvite, but not with calcium oxalate calculi. Calcium carbonate calculi will also decrease in size. What it looks like to me is that if we feed lambs for extended periods, it's almost inevitable we're going to run into problems with urinary stones because of all those predisposing factors I discussed. So that's why I'm particularly scared about feeding lambs from 12.5, 15 kilos. I think our 6-week finishing period tends to save us from a lot of grief when it comes to the formation of stones. So prolonged feeding periods are fraught with danger. So you've really got to look hard at how you're feeding those lambs. If you're in a situation where you say, well, we're just going to have to feed these lambs for 3 months to get them to where we want them, then I would suggest that you put a low concentration of ammonium chloride in just to help acidify the urine. If you overdo that and you chronically acidify the urine, you're also chronically acidifying the blood, you'll actually stimulate more calcium release from the bones, and then you'll end up with the formation of calcium oxalate calculi, because the oxalate can then come from the animal's own skeleton when it's mobilising calcium. So it's a bit of a snooker. Right, feed processing. I've got 10 minutes, I'm going to have to go like buggery. Roughage. How long should roughage be for lambs in a mixed ration? Anyone? 25 mils, fantastic. New car. Muzzle width applies to all species. So 25 mils, 20 to 25 mils for lambs. And with lambs, we have to make sure there's bugger all variation on that, or they'll sort. We end up with, they won't eat the fines and they'll sort off the longer particles. So roughage processing is something that has to be quite precise with lambs to get it to work well. With cattle, much easier. They're much more tolerant of coarser feeds. We're looking at about 5 to 10 centimetres in length with cattle, so muzzle width. Okay, dry rolled processing targets. Cattle, we've got some cattle people here. How many fragments per grain do we want for great utilisation of the grain without causing lactic or ruminal acidosis? Give me a figure. 2. You've won a new car. No, you don't. You've done this before. All right. It's approximately, the research figure is approximately 2 millimetres. It's 2 to 3 fragments per grain. And here's our example: barley, wheat, and sorghum, if you ever have the misfortune to have to use sorghum. The reason I'm so anti-sorghum is that it has a protein matrix that occurs right throughout the kernel and wraps up all the little parcels of starch. So to get good utilisation of all the starch in the sorghum, you have to smash that protein matrix. Now, if you did that with dry rolling in a way to maximise its availability, you'd end up with talcum powder. That's why sorghum is particularly appropriate to large enterprises that have steam flakers, because they can completely degrade that protein matrix and make all that starch available by gelatinising the starch, which breaks down the structure completely through the heat. Okay. Tempered. If anybody in the south is contemplating routinely feeding, I would suggest that you go to tempering with cattle. And we have had a situation where we had beef feedlot, lamb feedlot alongside each other, and it was easiest to use the processed grain for the lambs as well. Some people said, you'll kill them all. No, you won't. You actually increase intake slightly, and that you get some positive production effects from it. Hasn't been properly measured, so I can't give you any idea of the extent of that, but you can feed processed grain to lambs. There's no reason you couldn't. With cattle, it's essential we process that grain, because otherwise you lose vast amounts straight through the animal. It's not just biomass protein, you can have biomass starch as well. Right, moisture, where we're tempering, and this is dirt cheap. You just need a steeping silo, steep cone bottom silo. We want to kick moisture up to about 23%. I've got 20 to 23. I much prefer to see higher moisture content in there. And then we roll it like we normally would. Now, this is the bulk density of the tempered grain, and we assess our targets as they relate to the bulk density of the parent grain. So, you might have barley at 65. We're getting this to 41 to 44 kilograms per hectolitre. So we're reducing the bulk density of that grain. Processing index of 63 to 65. That means the bulk density of the processed grain over the parent grain. Barley at 21%, 45 kilograms per hectolitre. See, we've got a big squashed, crimped grain. It looks like Uncle Toby's oats. You'd eat it yourself. Sometimes I do, if I get caught short for breakfast. Okay, barley with higher moisture, 45 kilograms per hectolitre. You just increase the surface area for utilisation, for exposure to action by the microbes without producing fines. So there's no fines in that. If you did that just with dry rolling, you end up with a heap of fines, and because there's such vastly greater surface area with fines, then it's excessively available to the microbes in the rumen, and you cause overgrowth of lactate-producing organisms, and that pushes pH down really dramatically. Okay, lamb feedlotting. This first 20 days is where we have most of our headaches. Yeah? Sprouted, as in, no, so not reconstituted, just sprouted. I'd save the money on the sprouting and just feed it as is would be my approach, yeah. So the big thing we struggled with lambs, or struggle with lambs, is getting them up and flying on feed early. So we haven't messed around with electrolytes, don't have solid data on it. I think maybe it helps under some circumstances. And the issue here is, as I was saying earlier this morning, time off feed. And time off feed is related to the overgrowth of salmonella in the intestines, and that kills them quick smart. If we can't get feed into these lambs quick smart, as soon as they arrive at the feedlot, we will start getting belted with salmonella, a real issue during the hot months. I see Will's quietly nodding here. Yeah, a real issue during the hot months. So that's why we tried to use electrolytes, just try to get some fluid into them and get them eating quick smart, and also to kick their blood sugar up. Chop rations first 24 hours. So we just want to fill the rumen with something safe and palatable, get the buggers eating, get some fermentation going. Training for novel feed and water delivery, which comes back to the issues that were raised this morning about exposure, prior exposure to grain, and making sure they can drink out of a water trough. Sometimes we get lambs off board drain country and the buggers don't know to drink out of the trough. They're not that smart. So in that situation, you're probably better off to run the trough over for a few hours and get them up and onto the water. Sorting on body weight. When we think about this, 5 kilos on, plus or minus 5 kilos on a 35 kilo lamb is a big percentage variation. And I don't think we give enough thought to the range that we're dealing with in lambs as opposed to cattle, where we generally, as a percentage of body weight, have tighter groups. Intake of coarse silages is low. I would say intake of silages in lambs generally is low. They don't like wet feed. They like dry feed. Anything that's high in moisture. We tried to feed them cottonseed. Fantastic. Heaps of oil. Energy dense. That'll be great. We ended up virtually coating every seed in molasses and trying to feed it to them individually, and the buggers still would sort it out. So we found that once we were above about 1% in those intermediate and final diets, they still left it. So we dropped it, couldn't get them to eat it. Not with good high intakes. So we basically pulled it out. Can't make it work. Roughage has to be a mean of 25 mils with very little variance, as we mentioned. Protein density is critical, and we're looking for about 20% as UDP. So that's 16 to 18% that I mentioned before. Energy density, we've been through this stuff before. Adaptation period, about 15% with 5% increments in increases in grain inclusion. So where we're feeding a total mixed ration. So we have much more control over what they're eating. In a mixed ration, they get roughage and grain with every mouthful. We have much more control over it. Where we're feeding concentrate in feeder bins separate to roughage, it is much harder to regulate. So we're increasing our slats opening by so many mils a day. Just do it really gradually and keep an eye on faecal consistency. My preference with those systems is to feed, as well as a white cereal, so barley or wheat, we really try to feed some oats to give them roughage as well as a lower carbohydrate grain, plus a pulse. So if we can do all that, if we can give them oats with barley and say lupins, peas, beans, and if you use pulses to get good intakes, you need to mill them because otherwise they sort the buggers out. Through those feeder bins, we can do that reasonably safely as long as we open those slats very gradually. It's going to take a couple of weeks to get them up and flying, but we've got to be content to do that or we will overwhelm their capacity to absorb those fermentation end products. So if we have that mix of grains, we can make it work. If we just have to feed high white grain, high barley, high wheat, triticale, my preference, and this is where you have to actually deal with a vet, is to use Alkaline to get those lambs onto that grain without killing them. Now, there's a welfare aspect to this as well. So I think it is inexcusable for us to have a system where we kill lambs with acidosis if we're not using an agent that can be applied to stop them from dying. So I think we need to keep that in mind. That's a pretty hill in New Mexico. I don't know why I took that. Oh, I was going for a drive. I have to make it quick. I had a weekend in the US and I was in Texas and they said, oh, what are you going to do? I said, oh, I'll go for a drive, go to New Mexico, shoot across to Colorado and then swing my way back. And they looked at me as though that was a big drive. I said, well, you know, they're only small states. You can drive through a few in a day. Fantastic, really riles them up, especially in Texas. Right, main issues, salmonella and pneumonia. And pneumonia behaves in the same way in lambs as it does in cattle. Stress-induced condition. We don't have good data to support the use of shearing. Time off feed and water is all important. We've got to get them started again. Okay, with salmonella, this is something we're still battling with. Its infectious challenge might be important, but I think the main thing is just inanition, time off feed. We've got to get them feeding. There's our shearing shed. Sometimes if you have a shearing shed and it looks really nice, you feel obliged to use it because it's a really good shed. We need more research, and you might have picked that up this morning, that I keep saying, yeah, I think that applies to lambs, don't know. We need to do more research on that. I always prefer to include those additives with the grain, as long as you're not getting too much separation. And Virginiamycin escalin is a more effective preventative of lactic acidosis than bicarb, but you might well use both. Okay? Right, feed delivery targets. Now these principles apply to total mixed rations, whether it's cattle or sheep, so you can take these home for the same purpose. Crumbs left at the time of feed delivery. That's what we've got there. There we have it, right along with the broom. You might get a hatful at the end of the trough. And there's been some really neat work to show that if we just take the cap off absolute maximum intake that you get with ad lib feeding, then you get a better feed conversion ratio. And that's probably to do with the maintenance requirements of the viscera, the guts. So we think by getting them to clean their own troughs out each day, that pretty much approximates about 5% off. And those feed conversion ratio improvements have been found with research to exist between 5% and 15% under maximum ad lib intake. So this is how we make it work in practice. And at the time feed is delivered, doesn't matter whether it's cattle or sheep, we're looking for the 70-30 rule. What the hell is the 70-30 rule? When feed is delivered, we want to see about 70% of the mob walk up and either go straight to the feed or, because they can't all fit at once, or to be behind the stock on the feed bunk, standing back going, I'm interested and I'm ready to take my turn to eat, but I'm not going to jump on them, push, bellow, bleat, carry on. And the other third will be down the pen playing chess, filling in time. This is what it looks like. So as feed goes in, we see the cattle moving to the trough. They're interested. There's no feed left there, and these cattle have got there. They've gone, yeah, okay, this looks good. I like eating. As the feed goes in, we end up with a full bunk, but there's no cattle jumping, jostling, any of those sorts of issues. If you run them too tight, if you're not feeding them enough, then you end up with an increase in non-eaters or poor performers. You get more of a tail on the pen, lambs or cattle, and with cattle you can end up with more bullers because you're increasing dominance interactions. There's a bit more to bullers than that, but that can be a contributor. And then we've got our other third, back of the pen, playing chess, being happy. Okay, how do we assess how well our feed milling and feed delivery is going? We daily monitor for every pen fecal consistency. So I'll use the cattle example first. This is undoubtedly a watery, bubbly scour. I don't think anyone could argue with that. Now, sometimes I've heard about this mythological protein scours. Protein scours do not exist. What happens with initial rumen pH depression is that you irritate the lining of the rumen and rumen outflow increases. It kicks the feed out faster to the extent that in cattle it's still fermenting on the way out. That's what the bubbles are from. There's actual microbial activity going on in that liquid feed as it hits you in the boots from about 5 yards away. Now that is a clinical sign of lactic acidosis. That's indisputable. Now, how we interpret that and the cut-offs that we respond to, that's probably open to debate. So for me, if I see 3% or more of these when I just do a walk through the pens, I say, okay, well, let's have a chat to the feeders and see what's happening with these cattle. They might have just been put up a ration, so they might have just had a jump in grain inclusion. Now, okay, they'll probably settle down over the next few days. If you get a high rate of watery bubbly scours, you say you've got 10%, what are you going to do? Who are you going to call? Hey? Panic. You've got to do something more than panic. Run in circles, yell and shout. Feed them more roughage. That's the bloody answer. How are we going to do that? How are we going to feed them more roughage? Yeah, oh, damn. Throw hay in the pen. Yeah, if you're desperate, you can. I really don't like that. Because then you've lost control over who's eating what, and you end up with a dirty quagmire where the hay is. Sometimes there's no choice but to do that. My preference is to run some roughage over the top of the feed. Get them to eat it there. You've got more control over what's going on. If that doesn't suit your system, you might have to put hay in the pen. Say you've just stepped them up a ration. So you just kicked them up 10% grain. And I would say also with cattle, so lambs we try to keep our increments to 5% because they're such finicky little buggers. Cattle, I try to keep it inside 10, and sometimes I see diets that start out at 20% grain and then next ration has 50 and it goes to 70. That's crazy. That's too much for them to handle in one jump. So if you've just gone up a ration, you might give them a little extra roughage, but in most cases, unless it was extreme, I'd be just checking them again tomorrow to make sure they handle it. Because you can get some short-term upset, which will fairly rapidly resolve. Now with lambs, I mentioned this morning, toothpaste. Anything looser than toothpaste has me worried. And that's a similar sort of cut-off, more than 3% when you walk through the pens. So I have heard the statement that, if you've got loose faecals, that's good, you're pushing them hard enough. No. You're actually causing a less efficient rumen fermentation. Because to get our greatest energy yield from that fermentation, we want to have the rumen in a window between 5.7 and 6.2 pH. That gives us the greatest propionate yield, which gives us the greatest growth rate. Now, if we consistently or periodically drop below that 5.7, we have a less efficient rumen fermentation, we get less energy yield. So causing acidosis is not in keeping with good production. It causes reduced production. So don't see that as an endpoint. Okay, because I went rocketing through, because I thought I had to be finished on the hour, we actually have almost come to the conclusion. No, that's right, I'm getting my terminal slides mixed up. It's pretty hard to see here, but this is a bar in Dallas, Fort Worth. Can we actually turn off those front lights? Is that possible? Because this is a very important slide to everybody's understanding. And the neat thing was I had saddles on posts next to the bar. And it is the most stable thing you ever sat on to have a few beers. You will not lose it off that sort of stool. Fantastic. Stirrups, the whole works. Okay. We'll just wait and see if we can actually have a look at that. Okay, let's not worry about that. BRD. If you are going to feed cattle, drought lot, feedlot, doesn't matter, you are going to run into bovine respiratory disease. And in fact, in any situation where you intensively manage cattle, you're going to run into BRD. And it is often undiagnosed or underdiagnosed in the grazing sector. Now, I've spent decades of my life working with BRD, so when I see it in our cattle, and we have an intensive grazing system, I can recognise it. It's a disease of intensification. So if you're trading cattle and you're pulling them in from various sources and you're sticking 150 head in a 12.5 acre paddock on a rotational grazing system, you will see BRD. Same principles apply as apply to the feedlot, but we're not, in most cases, imposing ruminal acidosis on them. We can be if we stick them straight onto really lush grazing oats or improved temperate pastures, we can actually cause ruminal acidosis in those instances as well. And acidosis also increases the incidence of BRD. So there's a whole lot of stuff happening there. This is what that fella looks like, the animal with BRD. And how would you describe him? What's he look like? Listless, that's good. Unhappy, listless and unhappy. Sort of sounds like Sunday morning after Saturday night. What else? So if somebody, you had a backpacker turn up from Sweden and you said, okay, I want to describe what BRD looks like. You've got listless, unhappy. What else are you seeing there? Yeah, he's got the candles going, absolutely. So he's got nasal discharge and it's thick and purulent, pussy. Yeah, maybe it was just a wet winter. Yeah, that's just a normal presentation, really. Heads down. Head carriage gives you a lot of information. Ears, not working, not being attentive. He's not responding to his environment. So the research definition of BRD is any 2 or more of the signs of lethargy, depression, which is listless and unhappy, nasal and or oral discharge, and breathing abnormality. That's it. So that's what he looks like. And just after I took the slide, he had the good grace to give me a big wet cough. So I said, I think this fella's crook. So that is an advanced case. We have to get them earlier than that. So if you have an intensive system, and this applies to yard weaning as well, and I have seen BRD in yard weaned calves, particularly when it's dusty. So we have to actually get in and treat them when they first just look depressed and lethargic. No other signs. They might not have a nasal discharge, they might not have breathing difficulty. If you see them like that, don't wait till tomorrow, because the single most important determinant of treatment success is getting onto them early, treating them early. Here's our archetypal Schmeriford. Have any Hereford breeders here? No, none. Really, there's got to be some. Fair dinkum. Well, Herefords are the vet's cattle. I love them. Plenty of calving problems, pink eye, eye cancer, and BRD. They actually get respiratory disease at a higher rate than any other breed. They are magnificent. I've got free straws of Hereford semen if anybody wants some after the presentation. Love them. Postmortem. So we've cracked chest open. With these acute cases, and these fellas can die within 24 hours. You get a severe infection with a nasty like Mannheimia hemolytica, which as I said is the MH in the vaccine, they can roll over in 12, 24 hours. And all you see is purplish discoloration of those lungs. So that's a very acute, rapid change. So if we see these at the feedlot, I don't go shooting stockies. I say, okay, well, you know, we probably wouldn't have found that one. He died too quickly. And then as it goes on, if they live for long enough, and particularly with other organisms that are not as severe and acute, you end up with pus being formed, consolidation of the lungs. So this is probably a couple of weeks duration. So we've missed him either a couple of weeks ago or he arrived crook. And over time, and particularly with agents like Acidifying, you end up with bucket loads of this fibrin, which is an inflammatory product that sticks everything together. So when you get feedback from the abattoir and they say you've got lambs or cattle with pleurisy, it's inflammation of that lining on the inside of the chest and the covering of the lungs, and it ends up sticking together. And it is amazing how little functional tissue these poor buggers can survive on. So that's been going a few weeks. Now that, appropriately, and it is just as well I rushed earlier, that's my finishing slide, because it's telling me to stop, but can anybody see what's wrong with this photo? That's what happens with councils, you know. Sometimes they just don't look. I found that confusing. It was New South Wales. We must have a Mexican here. So it's routine in feedlots that we train the stockies to do postmortems, because the feedlot vets are not there all the time. You know, we just have regular visits, but most days we're not there. So we train them to do the postmortems. What you can do is, if you have a relationship with a vet, you can do the postmortem, and you know what normal looks like because you've done plenty of your own slaughter, so you know that. So if you see something looks different, you take a photo with your phone, and you text it to your vet. Say, what do you make of this? So it's a really handy tool. I remember in the mid-90s, I went to Canada and I came back full of enthusiasm. I said, it's got this fantastic thing over in Canada and it only costs about $6,000. It's called a digital camera. And you can send those images over the internet. It's fantastic. We've got to get one. Now, everyone's got one. Okay, depends on the system. So where you're feeding a total mixed ration in troughs, we go for high quality roughages. If you've got a system with feeder bins with concentrate separate to roughage, we start them on the goodies, and then once that's finished over the first 5 days, say, then we go on to coarser roughage because we want them to eat the concentrates and not the roughage. Yeah.
In your rations, you didn't mention corn.
No, I didn't either. There's not much corn fed in Australia. I know you feed it, but it's not something that I've had much to do with, I have to admit. So the question was about corn. Do many people here feed corn? It's truth. We've got heaps of them. I'm going to have to get up to date on corn. Did you have a question on corn?
Just as compared with, I noticed when I feed lads some corn, they rush for the corn and that's where it sounds.
Okay, so highly palatable. The other thing about corn is it's more slowly fermented, which is a real advantage if you have to feed separate concentrates. So I'm a fan of corn, it's just that I don't usually get access to it. So I'm glad you do down here. Okay, so if you're drought feeding ewes, we basically, I don't like the idea of limit feeding a high energy dense feed because then you create a whole lot of digestive upsets, you get dominant sheep, big tail. So the way we regulate that is we decrease the cost of the feed by feeding lower energy dense feeds. So we meet our protein requirements, lower energy, coarser roughages, cheaper roughages, and basically feed them so that they're all having a full feed each day, but keep the energy density down. And you can feed in bigger mobs. Just be careful you don't get tails developing. If you see the tail developing on the mob, you need to draft them off and feed them separately. But yeah, it is a very different management strategy, which we do mainly through decreasing energy density. You can leave corn whole for sheep, but certainly need to roll it for cattle. In Australia's corn, you can get some misleading information from the US because they have softer corn. Ours is quite hard, so we really need to roll it for cattle. Yep. And 3 fragments is probably a good target. No, there's still, you're missing out on a lot of starch utilisation if you see whole grains come through. Yeah. I can, in 25 words or less. So the question was, describe the difference between Virginia mycin, bicarb and acid buff. Right, bicarb, sodium bicarbonate, when it hits the rumen, it releases the sodium, it absorbs a hydrogen ion, so an acid ion if you like, and that then converts the remainder into water and CO2, carbon dioxide, and they burp that out. So Virginia mycin is an antibiotic which actually selects against gram-positive organisms in the rumen, chiefly strep bovis, and strep bovis is the bug that tends to overgrow when we shovel in too much starch too quickly, and that produces lactic acid. And lactic acid is a much, much more powerful acid than the volatile fatty acids that are normally produced, and that pushes pH down quite rapidly, which then gives an opportunity for lactobacillus or lactobacilli species to grow like buggery, which makes pH much lower. So that's how Virginia mycin works, selects against lactate producers. What was the other one? Acid buff. Okay, predominantly a form of calcium carbonate, so it has an alkalinising effect without a direct buffering effect, if that makes sense. So it doesn't grab and release hydrogen ions or acid ions, it just pushes rumen pH up through tying up acid, if that makes sense. Okay, the question was, should bypass proteins be a consideration in ration formulation? If you are looking to break records with lambs or lightweight cattle, yes. And we aim for that 20% bypass. But I wouldn't spend huge amounts of money to get it. On a least cost ration formulation, when you specify your targets, I would be driving rumen degradable protein first and foremost. Then you often pick up sufficient bypass if you kick in protein meals to meet that requirement. So it's a secondary consideration which you would consider with really high production. And that's my last question. Thank you all for your participation. I'll be around the rest of the day, so if you have questions, grab me and fire away. Sorry, Will, I'll get out of the way.